measure as one of the poorest countries in Asia. Yet it too is experiencing a television news explosion that is again transforming politics and pushing semi-feudal politicians, which is a very apt description for many of India's politicians as well, into a need to be more responsive, if only on the surface level, to the concerns of people out there. It's also, in India, television unmasking corruption and you know, testing the words of politicians, finding out hypocrisy at all levels. And you know, this is, I say to my friends, in and of itself a wonderful thing, and it augments the work of the press and of investigative journalists and of marvelous filmmakers and of documentarians. And as long as these other forces are able to, you know, to force themselves into that world and to really try to get their standards recognized broadly by others, the televisual audience, then only good will come of it. And it's a struggle because it's one we go through in America and in Canada and in Britain all of the time, but I think it's an ongoing struggle that has a good outcome. Television news does another thing too very, very well, and this is true of the medium as a whole. It really is a medium. Yes, there's a high entry level for corporate participation and hardware and purchase of technology, but it does require one thing from people that is broadly available outside of the usual traditional elite paths. It requires really, really, really special creative energy that, yes, is at first found largely amongst existing elites, amongst graduates of the usual elite institutions, universities, and so on. But also, and I've seen this in my time doing television in India from the early 90s, you know, originally the camera operators we used to hire in India were not members of the elite. They were not necessarily people who spoke fluent English. They were members of the lower middle classes, urban and semi-urban. They were people who had been technicians, whose parents had perhaps had photography shops, something to do somehow with visual culture. I once worked with a camera person whose father had been an artisan who painted walls in villages for people. Again, he was part of a visual culture. There's an entry level at the creative end of television that is much lower than at, say, you know, at the capital corporate other end. Television requires lots of people. It requires a television network, a television news channel, a cluster of channels requires hundreds, if not thousands of people. It requires technicians, it requires technologists, it requires salespeople, it requires white collar, blue collar. It is blind to issues of gender and caste and other things because it requires people who are quick studies, who work very quickly, who solve problems that come up unexpectedly. It does not have any time at all for time servers, for you know, overtly feudal office relations. Obviously those things exist in television structures the way they exist in every other structure in the subcontinent, but the system is such that if the place is to compete, it soon drums them out. I've seen that in almost every leading Indian television institution. People who do not pull their weight, or people who are there because they are the daughter or son of a famous person, but not able to live up to the standards of the team, end up, you know, marginalized and out, or off in another service that is a little more conducive to their type of work. There's also the intangibility of television. You know, that's the interesting thing about it to me. It's an intangible product. It's in defiance of Newton's laws of thermodynamics. It's the creation of something from nothing. The television image, just like the cinema image, is something that wasn't there before. In the case of television or digital imaging of any sort, or even analog imaging on old analog cameras, it is basically just the manipulation of electricity. So what's required again is the input of people to make this work. You're not taking a natural resource and shifting people so you can build something to process it and creating a lot of effects that ripple outwards around you in a physical sense. You're actually creating something from nothing. And I think that, you know, that does throw up various challenges that we have seen in India. We've seen it from the time of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, that what was an absolutely marvelous social phenomenon, a great you know, mixing of entertainment with cultural instruction, if you will, or cultural, bonding between various levels of people, between Hindus and Muslims and others who might not necessarily share the religious myth behind this. What we saw was that the Hindu right was able to exploit the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, was able to take its sort of Hindu message and turn it to their advantage. And it all culminated in the early 90s with the horrible destruction of the Babri Mosque and the rise of the BJP and Hindu nationalist politics after that. But the Gutenberg press also was used to print Mein Kampf as well as the works of Gandhi and others. So it's a question of, if you're going to create something from nothing, you have to mediate it not with regulation and not with prohibition and not with restriction, but with the broadening of access so that community standards become quite important. And so, with television, if a television station goes too far, and again, many of them have, especially, in family stations being a bit too risque or a bit too, a bit too willing to expose celebrity sex scandals and all their plumbing and all their wondrous, Clinton, for example, and Monica back in the 90s. I mean, that shocked India, that shocked the world. A, that America was spending so much time on something, and the American media was, and B, that, primetime discourse was so explicit about what's private sexual acts. Then the community steps in and says, no, this is not permissible. This is not. They step in by changing the channel. They step in by writing letters, and if they have to, they step in by staging a demonstration outside a station. It all has an impact. Politics in India, as I was saying earlier, pays great heed now to the need to use television to disseminate its message. But I'm happy to say that the Indian news television tradition is more akin to the British tradition than the American when it comes to journalism. In America, I've noticed, as someone who's worked here as a journalist and as well worked in Britain, that high figures of power are treated with great respect and asked quite fawning questions often. And the higher they are, the more fawning the questions. Whereas the Brits are very fond of asking the toughest questions from the outset. Famously, a man called Jeremy Paxman, who presents a program called Newsnight, a nightly program in Great Britain on the BBC, once asked the leader of the Liberal Democratic Party, who was known to be is a good man, but rather unfortunate alcoholic, and it was showing in his work. Paxman started his interview with him by saying, "What would you say if I told you, and this is true, that everyone we spoke to about doing this interview said, well, I hope you get him before 10 o'clock when he's still sober." And the interview went on from there. And he's been the same with Tony Blair. He's asked Tony Blair the same question 18 times when Tony Blair tried to skate around giving a direct answer to why the Iraq invasion was at all justified. I'm glad to say that that's the case, and many Indian interviewers behave that way, championing the values of their listeners, and not, as I see all too often in America, and as we saw, as we've seen in many cases, certainly in the past 8 years when hard questions needed to be asked from our television anchors.